Now draw some out and take it to the chief steward. So they took it. When the stewards tasted the water that had become wine, they did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. And the steward called the bridegroom, and he said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk. But you've kept the good wine until now." Jesus did this, the first of his signs in Cana of Galilee, and he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. And that ends our reading for this morning. It's the word of God for the people of God.
Be to God.
At the very start of John's Gospel, the author begins, before he tells his story, with this grand abstract theology that takes us back to the beginning of the time. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, says John. And then the climax, this Word became flesh and dwelt among us, full of truth and grace. And then this, from his fullness, John declares, we have received grace upon grace. A superabundance of grace was revealed in this man, Jesus, who is the light that shines in the darkness. As a theological term, grace refers to God's love and help given to us, not because we have done anything to earn it, but as a pure gift, simply because that's the nature of God, to love us, to delight in us like children. John uses the word grace 4 times in quick succession in that little abstract opening. And then, curiously, he never uses the word again in the rest of the gospel. It's as if he understands that grace as a word is an abstraction, disembodied. Grace needs to take on flesh. It needs to be experienced in our bodies. So instead of talking about grace, John offers us stories in which we are invited to place ourselves with our imagination in the stories in order to experience in a very visceral way what grace feels like, that gift of God's love. And John tells us 7 stories in which Jesus performs what we would call miracles, but John calls signs. Because in John's mind, the point isn't for us to focus on the miracle itself, but to look beyond to what the miracle reveals. A God who gives life and gives it abundantly right here, right now. And so this morning's story is the first of the 7 signs, and it might seem an odd choice to be the one that gets the status of being the first sign. At a wedding party where the hosts have run out of wine, Jesus turns water into wine. We are accustomed to Jesus using his powers to relieve human suffering, a worthy purpose for sure. And so turning water into wine, in contrast, can seem almost frivolous. Apparently, though, parties, and in particular, the shared joy of parties, is near and dear to the heart of God. Wine is a symbol of joy. Wedding feasts were Jesus' favorite image of the kingdom of God, what it feels like. And in this case, we're talking about an enormous quantity of wine, perhaps as much as 180 gallons of wine. Can you imagine that? not just any wine, the best tasting wine ever. A superabundance of this wondrous wine that allows the wedding feast to continue on, in fact, move up a notch. That's what God's grace feels like. So rather than talk about the idea of grace, perhaps it's better to call to mind experiences in our own lives when we have experienced something of that superabundance of grace. I had such an experience 23 years ago when I wrote my first real play. I've written 13 plays since, but none have ever flowed through me so rapidly with such super abundance of inspiration and creativity as this first play. When I sat down to begin writing, 3 weeks is all that it took to finish the task. I heard the characters talking in my head, and I just sit down and write what I heard. The inspiration for the play came from two images that came to me. The first came from a short devotional I happened to read a couple of years earlier in the United Methodist upper room. The author was a woman who described the blessing it had been for her family to have her elderly mother-in-law live with their family during the last year of her life. The old woman's declining health kept her confined to a hospital bed, which, because of the limited space in the house, was placed right there in the family's living room. This was a family with 4 active teenagers who were constantly inviting their friends over to hang out in the house. And so this sweet-spirited old woman wasn't hidden away as she was essentially going through her time of dying. Rather, she was right there in the midst of everything that was happening in this life-filled house, a full participant, enjoying the companionship of her grandchildren and their friends. The old woman was essentially in hospice care, and we generally think of dying as heart-wrenching, but in this case, although there was surely much sadness, there was also an abundance of grace and joy. The woman writing the piece described those months with her mother-in-law present in their home as being a very special blessing. When the time came for the grandmother to die, though the family surely wept, their faith allowed them to let her go, entrusting their grandmother to the light and love of God, cherishing the precious memories of the special time they had shared together in those last months of her life. The story made an impression on me. The woman who wrote the little devotional, just 1 page long, was named Lillian Grip, an unusual name that stayed with me, and sometime later, when Bill and Amy Grip moved from Nutley to Parsippany and began attending the church, I eventually made the connection. Yes, it turned out that Bill had been one of those 4 teenage grandchildren. The connection seemed a bit mysterious. So 23 years ago, an image began floating about in my imagination of a little girl who talks to Jesus as her best friend, a friend nobody else can see. At some point, I put this little girl into the setting that Lillian Grip had conjured up for me, a family with a beloved dying grandmother present in a bed in the dining room. And it was soon thereafter that I sat down to write, and as I said, the story just poured through me. And where plays usually take me months to write, I was finished with this one in just 3 weeks. Typically, when I write plays, there is a certain degree of tedium involved. I have to discipline myself to show up in front of my computer to see what I can crank out. But writing this play wasn't like that. I sat down with anticipation to see what would happen next. Once the play was written, the casting quickly fell into place, becoming very much of a family affair. My 8-year-old stepdaughter, Kate, played the girl I named Lydia. My wife, Sarah, took the part of her anxious and troubled mother. My own mother, a gifted actress, played the part of the dying grandmother, the one and only time I ever got to work on theater with my mother. And this was a challenge for me. I played the pastor. The mother calls in order to try to talk her daughter out of her apparent delusions, a pastor who ends up instead getting his own faith renewed. And my oldest and best friend, David Turner, took the part of Jesus. And Tracy's brother, Tim, played the angry teenage brother of Lydia, and my son, Andrew, ran the lights. The memory of that production remains to this day a very special blessing for our family, particularly since my mother left this world about 5 years ago. We performed the play here, and it seemed to touch people deeply. Our district superintendent came to see the show, and he liked it so much he arranged to have us perform it 8 months later at our annual conference in the big gymnasium at Centenary College in front of 500 people, including all my fellow United Methodist pastors from northern New Jersey. The night of the production, we had some technical difficulties to work out while the audience waited patiently for over a half hour. Finally, we were ready to go. Kate was making her entrance that began the show when suddenly all the lights went out. I stepped out on the stage to address the audience with faked confidence. Thank you for your patience. We'll have this straightened out in short order. But I had no clue why the lights had gone out. And it seemed quite conceivable to me that they were simply unfixable. And there was a part of me that was absolutely horrified. Really, Lord? Really? You brought me this far only to have me utterly humiliated in front of all my peers? So turning back to our gospel story. It reaches a similar point. In those days, wedding parties went on for a full week. These weddings required wine, and lots of it. And early on in this particular wedding, for some reason, the wine runs out. Now, this doesn't rank up there with being diagnosed with a malignant cancer or watching your child starve to death. But nonetheless, this would have been a major public humiliation for the bride and groom and their parents. From that point on, they would have been known in Cana as the people who threw the party but couldn't manage to have enough wine. Initially, Jesus seems to rebuff his mother when she calls attention to the fact that the wine has run out. Throughout the Gospel of John, Jesus seems intent on making the point that we're not in control, God is. God acts in God's time and not on our timetable. The wind blows where it wills, Jesus tells Nicodemus in the next chapter. So it is with the Spirit. We don't control when the Spirit of God chooses to blow. We simply need to be ready when it does. Nonetheless, Jesus performs a miracle, and the superabundance of the best tasting wine is suddenly on hand, although the wedding steward and presumably most of the people present are totally oblivious to the graciousness with which God has acted on their behalf. So back to the aborted opening of our show at Centenary College. I was feeling panic-stricken and utterly clueless as to where to even begin to solve the problem, but within 30 seconds, the lights were back on. It just so happened that a woman contracted by the conference to work with the sound system had the opportunity the year before to become familiar with the dilapidated electrical system of the Centenary College gymnasium. She knew exactly where to go and which switch to turn. And so the show proceeded without glitch. And when in the last scene, the grandma breathes her last breath and then glides to the front of the stage from the bed where her family is gathered, she meets her husband, where the two of them begin dancing down the center aisle, surrounded by sparkling lights. Everybody in the place, myself included, were weeping, I think, with tears of joy. did this a few years ago, and Maggie played Lydia. It would be nice if life would always come this way to us so seamlessly, but of course it doesn't. The wine does run out, and far worse things as well. But the message of our gospel story, it seems to me, is that by and by, in God's good time, a superabundance of grace and joy will be revealed to us, that in spite of all that seems so terribly wrong in this world, a wedding feast with an abundance of the best tasting wine is as good an image as we have for what God intends to give us. And though we often wait with heavy hearts in the midst of this broken world, Jesus has come to give us joy, abundant life, even now. Those of you who have known me for a while know that I like to really cut loose when I dance. At wedding celebrations that I attend, which is relatively rare, there are typically quite a few jaws that drop when they see the pastor going hog wild on the dance floor. I enjoy busting the common stereotype at such moments that clergy aren't supposed to be altogether approving of such merriment. But if truth be told, by nature, I am not inclined to be a light-hearted sort of guy. I often get caught up in the pain and the sorrow of this world. Though I love to dance, I don't actually go dancing very often. I typically feel like I have more things that need to be attended to than there's time to take aside to go dancing, and I'm prone to feel this anxiety and guilt if I'm not getting those things done rather than doing something that seems indulgent like going dancing. That's part of what this story is about. The central props of the story are significant. 6 large clay jars designed to hold 20 to 30 gallons of water that were customarily used for ritual purification. The dominant religion of the day was one that was all about keeping the laws. There were 624 of them. And people were obliged to do all they could to keep them, and they inevitably failed. And they were therefore rendered unclean. And so these jars had the water that was used for the rituals by which they were cleansed back to a state of purity and could re-enter society. So these jars represent a rather joyless form of religion, one where you can never do enough, and there is plenty of opportunity to experience guilt and anxiety over the possibility you are falling short in the eyes of God. That, the story tells us, is not what God has in mind for us. Jesus transforms the purpose of these 6 large jars. Now they are containers of the new wine, the symbol of joy that can get a person up and dancing. And what the God of delight likes to see us doing is exactly that. And this, I believe, is the direction God continuously is nudging us towards. When I took a sabbatical 13 years ago, I had the opportunity to slow down to try and listen for God's still small voice. One evening, sitting alone in the room I was staying at in a retreat house, perhaps in that state halfway between being awake and being asleep, I heard a voice speak. It was the one and only time I can recall that I ever heard a voice spoken that wasn't generated by a person. It was a woman's voice, and it said simply, "Ready to dance." Was that God speaking, or was that just my imagination? Who knows? But one of the things I believe is that God works through our imagination. We climb inside these Bible stories with our imagination and we experience something of God's grace. We imagine ourselves there in the midst of a crowd of 5,000 hungry people and no possibility that there could be enough food for all to eat. And suddenly this little boy steps forward happily, ready to offer his lunch to Jesus. It's not much, just 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. And Jesus takes it and he blesses it and he breaks it and he gives it to his disciples to pass out. And suddenly there is a superabundance of food, enough for everybody to have their fill and 12 whole baskets left over. And suddenly perhaps our problems, as we place ourselves in that story that have seemed to loom so large in our life, don't seem so large anymore. And life is seen as being full of the possibility of wondrously good things happening. Or we are there at a quiet dinner party with Jesus at the home of Mary and Martha in Bethany shortly before Jesus entered Jerusalem to die, and suddenly Mary has this alabaster jar full of very expensive perfume, and she breaks it open and pours out this superabundance of ointment upon Jesus' head, filling the room with this beautiful fragrance. It is a moment of exquisite joy. But then Judas, the rule keeper, the same rule keeper who lives, I suspect, inside of each one of us, tries to shut Mary down, telling her how this thing she has just done is absolutely wasteful, totally impractical, just the way 7-day wedding parties can be seen as utterly impractical. And maybe that voice inside of us is agreeing with Judas, and we start thinking about all the things we haven't gotten done with guilt and anxiety setting in. And then suddenly Jesus comes to Mary's defense. Leave her alone. She has brought some beauty and joy into this moment when we find ourselves living under the shadow of death. And for the rest of human history, people will draw inspiration from what Mary has done. And we sit there and we watch and we discover anew that our God is a God of joy who loves a good party. And perhaps we hear a little voice say, ready to dance? Please pray with me. Oh God, your love is abundant, bigger and wider than we can begin to take in. We live our lives often in such cramped space, not trusting your love to provide, not trusting your invitation to get up and dance with joy in our hearts. But that is your intention for us, that even in the midst of the sorrow of this world, right side by side, there can be joy. And you would have us not miss it. You would have us turn and become like little children dancing in the kingdom of heaven. May it be so. In Jesus' name.